Hello, and welcome to the Russell Report podcast. Today I want to share with you an article that appeared on the Africa and the World website in November last year. This article, written by Lawrence Freeman, is titled Climate Change, a Weapon to Prevent Industrialization of African Economies. The article does a brilliant job of showing how the climate change hoax is exploited to stop the industrialization of African countries and the hypocrisy of Western nations in telling them that they should stop using coal and gas. These African leaders, like Cyril Ramaphosa, understand exactly the consequences of implementing these policies, but they do it because they are not beholden to their own people but accountable to a new world order. Here in South Africa, Ramaphosa signed the Just Energy Transition Partnership in 2021 to reach net zero by 2050. According to this net zero goal, Eskom is required to systematically close all coal-fired power plants. The power utility expects to close a third of its coal-fired plants by 2030. Eskom has already taken 5,400 megawatts out of service, leaving the country permanently on stage 4 load shedding. Recently, Eskom has released schedules for stage 16 load shedding, which telegraphs their plans to remove a further 10,000 megawatts from the grid. Such a move will accelerate deindustrialization and lead to the total collapse of the country's economy. I will leave a link to the article in the description. But before I begin, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. According to Lawrence Freeman, Western nations and their institutions attempt to dictate that African nations do not exploit their own valuable energy resources of oil, gas, and coal. They are hysterically disseminating an unfounded fear that the development of Africa's energy will lead to catastrophic consequences for civilization. However, more African leaders are speaking out on the necessity and sovereign obligation for African nations to consume their natural resources to develop their economies. Mo Ibrahim has added his voice to other African leaders who object to denying African nations the right to utilize their natural hydrocarbon resources for the benefit of their people. Sub-Saharan Africa is resource-rich and energy-poor, which is the leading cause of poverty and hunger for hundreds of millions of Africans. Unless and until African nations install a density of energy to power the creation of industrialized economies, their people will continue to suffer. In a recent interview in The Guardian, titled, Billionaire Mo Ibrahim Attacks Hypocrisy Over Africa Gas, the philanthropist and Sudanese businessman bluntly criticized the obscene and unfair policy to prevent African nations from exploiting their gas reserves. We have 600 million people without electricity. How can we even think of development if people don't have power? Development is a major issue for us, and power is essential. 900 million people in Africa suffer from unclean cooking, mainly women. What about the pollution effect of that? It's a serious problem, a health disaster, and an environmental disaster. That's why we need gas. Contrasting the dictates from the US and EU, for Africans increasingly rely on so-called renewables, Mr. Ibrahim appropriately objected, if the renewable energy is valid, why don't those guys jump immediately and stop using gas? They're not doing that, they're building LNG infrastructure, they're actually even reopening coal mines. So, you're giving me advice which you're not following yourself. The hypocrisy of the West is blatantly obvious. Europe is in overdrive to obtain fossil fuels in Africa now that energy flows from Russia are in jeopardy. Last month, reporters from the New York Times wrote, European leaders have been converging on Africa's capital cities, eager to find alternatives to Russian natural gas. Europe turns to Africa for natural gas. What the West is demanding of African nations goes beyond hypocrisy, it is immoral and wicked. Every competent leader, as well as any honest economist, knows from the history of the development of modern society, that abundant and accessible forms of power have been essential for nations to progress. That is why all advanced sector nations have exploited fossil fuels in the past and continue to depend on them in the present, even as they demand that African nations do not. It is scientifically known that forcing African nations to rely on wind and solar as primary sources of energy will guarantee that these nations will not develop, will not become industrialized, will not be able to feed their populations, resulting in endless poverty. Freeman, therefore, asks, is this not a new, modern form of imperialism?
In October 2021, over 100 world leaders assembled in Glasgow to acknowledge the urgency of climate change. This summit was supposed to be a wake-up call, a turning point for this planet's future. But like all the summits that came before it, COP26 too ended up being a disappointment. It only gave developed nations a platform to list the sins of the developing world, their own transgressions notwithstanding. They set targets for others, goals to be achieved by 2050. Chief among them was ending coal burning, phasing out the world's reliance on coal. Europe pledged to lead the way. It promised to consign coal to history and shift to renewable sources of energy. 1 year on, the same Europe is leading the march in the opposite direction. Europe is conveniently turning back to coal, no questions asked. Tonight, we'd like to call out their hypocrisy. Why is Europe turning back to coal? Where does this leave their climate goals and the larger pledge they sanctimoniously took on behalf of the rest of the world? According to analysts, coal imports to the EU will be 43% higher next year. This will release an additional 10 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. 10 million tons. Where does this leave their climate goals? Their promise is to become carbon neutral. The EU is not talking about any of this. Running their air conditioners is evidently more important. In the meantime, studies like these are being offered as justification. This analysis was released by Ember. It is a UK-based non-profit think tank. It says short-term reliance on coal for emergency use will have little impact on Europe's climate commitments. And so there's no need to sensationalize the issue. Interestingly, on its website, this think tank also writes in bold, coal power must end to reverse the climate crisis. It's the single biggest contributor to climate change. What's worse, the same think tank lambasts developing nations, calls them out for not doing enough to adopt green energy. Now, here's the thing. We know that desperate diseases need desperate remedies. We know that Europe is going through a power crisis. It needs to keep the lights on. But this was the same argument given by developing nations. They need power to run their factories. They lack sources of alternative energy. Their economies are more vulnerable to drastic shifts. Europe had none of it. It remained sanctimonious. It lectured the global south, told them to shut their factories and ration coal. And now that Europe is in a fix, it doesn't think twice before turning to coal. They're rich, they can buy coal. They can change the rules while keeping the moral high ground. They can change the goalposts because air conditioning in the first world cannot be switched off. And this is classic Western hypocrisy, throwing money to get more oil and coal while telling the rest of the world to rely on solar and wind power, refusing to take responsibility for historical emissions, refusing climate compensation to developing countries. You may remember the Bonn climate talks in June. Developing nations sought a specific climate funding facility. They wanted financial aid to switch to renewable energy and cope with the impact of climate change, triggered by both the European Union and the United States. They consistently blocked discussions on the topic. They refused to provide climate-specific funds. How should the world deal with this high-handedness and this hypocrisy? First, the US walks out of climate commitments with a president who calls climate change a hoax. And now Europe switches to coal. What's the point of setting goals that no side intends to meet? Should the rest of the world, too, ditch their goals on net zero emissions?
The rich world's fossil fuel hypocrisy is certainly on full display. We've discussed this at a previous interview. In its response to the global energy crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you've got the wealthy G7 countries admonishing the world's poor to use only renewables because of climate concerns. But Europe and the US are begging for Arab nations to expand oil production. Germany is reopening coal power plants. Spain, Italy, ramping up African gas production. As you say in your book, the renewable religion hurts poor nations the most, right?
Absolutely. Look, we got rich off of fossil fuels. And then we're telling the poor, well, you know what? You don't need to do that. But they want to. They are looking at China, which basically lifted almost 1 billion people out of poverty with lots and lots of fossil fuels. Now, there is a problem with global warming, and that's, of course, why we should be investing a lot more in research and development to make sure we find the solutions that are actually going to power the rest of the 21st century with little or no CO2 emissions. But it's immoral, and it's also impossible to tell the poor world to say, no, you can't go down the same route. Of course they want to do the same thing. India, Africa want to do what China did. And unless we can show them a better way, and right now we're showing them much, much worse ways. We're basically showing the way of Germany. Hey, we're going to give up on fossil fuels. We're going to just rely on gas from Putin's Russia. We're going to close down our nuclear power plants, and we're going to be in a huge problem. That's not the way you make societies work, and it's not the way you advertise how to be smart and green to the rest of the world.
Coal is going to be with us for a long time. And we have a responsibility to invest on coal technology that makes it cleaner. And we reduce the emissions, but use what we're endowed with in the country, and that is called coal. Now, it's coal. Now, we're endowed with that. We've got it. What we should remember is that about 600 million Africans lack access to electricity, which explains why Africa remains underdeveloped. Africa is underdeveloped, but it is a rich continent. We have a responsibility to deal with that issue. We must therefore work together and mobilize financial support to solve Africa's energy challenges, which include lack of infrastructure. We must expand our grid capacity to enable additional connection and transmission. This will enable Africa to generate enough electricity to power its economies, including industrialization, manufacturing, and processing of its natural resources. So we're encouraging you to avoid the polarized debate on energy. Appreciate the fact that energy is going to be sustainable as a catalyst. If we appreciate that various technologies of energy must coexist and complement one another. If we work for that, we're going to succeed. But if we think that we must kill other technology and have one technology, we are going to pay the price. I'm sure many of you, as people in the space, you are following the developments. If you go to Germany today, they are reopening coal-generating power stations because Russia has closed its gas, and therefore they must go back to coal to get base load. Actually, after 30 years of no coal mining, UK has opened a coal mine after 30 years. We follow that. Today we say coal is corruption, coal is equal to corruption. China is currently building 43 coal-generating power stations as we talk here today. Japan is building 23 coal power stations as we sit here today. Here we say we must call them quicker. And I know that people who say that may not have been in the coal belt. The coal belt covers 10 cities in Mpumalanga. I'm not talking of the others in the periphery. I'm talking of Belfast, Carolina, Emelo, Henrina, Middleburg, Emalahleni, Uwagis, Kriel, Leslie, and Telmas. That is one continuous coal belt. And if we talk of transitioning, if it is just, justice must not just be done, it must be seen to be done. Number two, it must talk to people. People who are in that area are not numbers. They are human beings. They have life. They support families, and they actually depend on coal now for survival. And that talk to communities. If you want to have ghost towns and therefore breathe fresh air in darkness, it's up to us.